The character of Job. I think that this is a great topic. We spent a quarter talking about some very important stuff, but this angle will help us to reflect more on what kind of people are we and what would we like to be. In the introduction, the lesson raises some very interesting questions like, who was this man whom the Lord trusted so much that he challenged the devil over his faithfulness and integrity? Wow. Where do we start?
Okay, first and foremost, what is character? By definition, it's the moral and mental qualities that are distinctive to an individual, like his or her personality or his or her nature, temperament. And now that we have read the whole book of Job, we're at the end of it, and we have lived through some of his days and experiences, how would you describe Job's character?
I don't think that we should be making such judgments, but let's try to see what we can find from the texts in the Bible.
First and foremost, we remember that God mentioned in his conversation with Satan what was his perception of Job, and he said that he was perfect, upright, and God-fearing. What is interesting is that Job also considered himself as such, perfect, upright, God-fearing, as we read his own words in the book of Job, chapter 29, verse 8. A respected man by his community, man with power, but also men who cared for the poor and the needy, the widows and the strangers. He was part of the social fabric. He was a valuable contributor.
Okay, so many things. Let's step back for a second. You mentioned perfect, upright, and God-fearing. Perfect, it doesn't mean that he was without sin. Other translations have it as blameless, but the author digs further into the etymology of the original word and says that it means as well mature, fully grown, or in other words that Job has achieved the degree of development that heaven expected of him. So it's a process, and Job was continuing to grow. This is about perfect. Upright, or that he lived in a way that he could be called a good citizen. And fearing God, meaning that he was faithful to his relationship with God. And the text also adds that he eschewed evil. These are some quite of characteristics, but what does it mean in real life? The lesson points that Job was a very successful man in every way. But the key for me is in the respect that he had earned. Job was respected by the greatest and the lowest in society. He was respected on earth and on heaven. This is a great testimony of character, integrity, moral involvement, and so many other things.
And the lesson continues and reminds us that all the blame that Job received from his friends was a product of their interpretation of his character based only on the evolved unfortunate circumstances in his life. So in fact, Job's character was put to a test. Job looked well from outside, as we saw so far, but he was concerned how he looked from inside too. He says, I made a covenant with my own eyes, not to look lustfully at a young woman. What an impressive standard of morality for his time, and with no doubt for a time like ours.
It is important to be good with what you see when you turn back in your life. If we are honest and we turn back and look at our lives, what will we see? Will we have regrets? We learn interesting things from Job's retrospective. It's good to read through the text and think. Job had deep understanding about right and wrong, about the importance of what is in our hearts, thoughts, and actions. We also see that he had understanding and that he cherished human dignity and equality in times when this wasn't popular.
And also reading the lesson, it seems that Job was very much familiar with the law of God as we know it today, even before Israel appeared on the historic scene. In chapter 31, verse 24 and on, he talks about his denial of worship to God. and his denial to worship the sun, and his denial to worship the moon, all very common practices and rituals at his time. He considered that as unfaithfulness to his God, almost like making a reference to the second of the Ten Commandments. Speaking of character this lesson, Job sounds to me as one very realistic, self-critical follower of God who picked his decisions thoughtfully and built his house on a rock.
Job didn't overcome his big challenges and struggles out of nothing. His entire life he was growing and maturing with every choice that he made, with every action, with every judgment, with every step in his life. His victory was a testimony of a relationship built through his entire life. It's so important how we spend our days, what drives us, what excites us, what kind of people we want to be.
And in conclusion, we can rightfully say that Job brought glory to God's name. With his own imperfect life, he demonstrated God's principles and God's values and God's intent. People who wanted to know what God looked like were able to get a glimpse just by knowing Job. As simple as that.
Wow, what a privilege and responsibility. People learn about God through what they see in those who claim to know Him, through us. There is one more lesson to wrap up this quarter, so join us next week for some lessons from Job.